Greetings, my fellow travelers. Cliff Kelly here. Excuse me. Scout is not with me. Scout is at the groomers. He goes about twice a year and gets his nails done and has a shampoo and gets styled. Well, he doesn't get styled, but he always looks forward to that. So you got the old man today, flying solo. And maybe it's better that Scout isn't here this one time. I have information, on this last installment of our series entitled Notes on Amateur Hour in America from a Shining City on a Hill to a Ship of Fools in 1,335 Days. Part 3, Where We're Headed. I took more time with this than any of the ones before. It's a tad longer and deeper, but I think it's appropriate to the topic. And how dare anyone, including this man, tell you a little bit about where I think America is headed. Let's be clear. I am no prophet. I'm a university professor in semi-retirement. I'm a trained scholar. I am to some degree a social scientist and a historian. Those are my credentials. And I'm a student of the scriptures now for 4 decades. So I say all that not in defense of, but in support of the idea that I believe, aided and abetted by God's scriptures and a pretty healthy appreciation and constant tracking of news events and history, that one can make reasonable assessments of where it looks like we're going. I'm not hearing voices normally to tell you anything particularly prophetic. I'm not having dreams. Almost ever, but I can read. I keep saying that. I can read, I can think, I can assimilate information, as can you, and then try to project where it looks like we're going. I remember when we see the hurricane projections, there are 2 or 3 possible directions a storm can take. I'm going to do that today. In fact, I'm going to give you 3 possible directions I think America can head, one of them more probable. Okay, well, that's kind of a wordy introduction, but then I'm a wordy guy. Let's pray. Father, I thank you and praise you for the fact that we can think like you when we study and get near to you and try with all of our hearts and minds and prayer to understand what you understand in some degree. We look through a glass darkly, but in some degree. We can know the truth and thereby be made prepared and free to deal with our times. That's what I want to do today, Lord. I got a whole lot of ground to cover. Again, I'm going to skip and hopscotch a bit, a lot of long quotes that the discerning reader can consider for themselves, and help me to just highlight those very important high points that we have to focus on today. I thank you and praise you for what you're showing me, Lord. It is my great privilege in a labor of love to share it with these precious people. In Christ's name, amen. Yeah, okay, let's return to the scripture that sort of guided us as a rudder through these 3 sessions, and then I'll end today with an actual breakdown of that scripture from, again, 1 Corinthians 1:21. For when the world with all its earthly wisdom failed to perceive and recognize and know God by means of its own philosophy, God in his wisdom was pleased through the foolishness of preaching salvation procured only by Christ and to be had through him, to save those who believed, who clung to and trusted in and relied on him. Blessed be the reading of his word. Everything we've studied so far is leading up to a clearer understanding of that. Though at times, as we move through these forests of information, it may not seem so. A few quotations as always. This one, a well-known one from Thomas Paine. I quoted him last time, but in a little bit later section of his classic, The American Crisis, published in 16 installments and pamphlets between 1776 and 1783. For the record seems to show that Thomas Paine was not a believer, but he was, like Thomas Jefferson and many other founders, a believer in the ways of God, if you will, a tremendous respect for the written word. These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country. But he that stands by it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered. Yet we have this consolation with us, that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. Great words, true words, I think inspired by the God that he gave some respect to. Second one's from John Silber. I think he's passed away now. He was a kind of a quixotic guy, brilliant. He was an attorney. He was what I would then consider, back in the days when he was governor of Massachusetts, a conservative Democrat. They used to have those. I could name a few that preceded him, but he, his views were a little mixed at times. But I loved this book that I read back in the 80s, Shooting Straight: What's Wrong with America and How to Fix It. And he had some great insights in that work. This is one of them. Quote, "The gospel preached during every television show is, you only go around once in life, so get all the gusto you can. I remember the Budweiser commercial." It is a statement about theology, by the way. It is a statement about beer. It's lousy beer and even worse theology. And he was prophetic in that insight, because that has become, I think, again, I allude so many times to another work in the 80s, Neil Postman's Amusing Ourselves to Death. I'm intrigued by the desperation with which the sports industry is trying desperately to save sports. If you're an athlete, if you're a fan of a particular team, as I used to be, still enjoy the Dodgers winning the World Series from a distance. I gave up on the LA Rams way back in the day, in the 60s. But it's a sign of the times that if you take sports away, America almost doesn't know what to do with itself. Men, primarily. So we'll watch that as one of those signs. Having fun. Enjoying ourselves, even in church. Third and finally, we have a rather sober work by Robert O. Paxton entitled The Anatomy of Fascism, published in 2004. Listen to what he says, although this was written some time ago. Quote, there's a mistake right there. "Knowing what we do about the fascist cycle, that is, the historical loops that are made from fascism to other forms of government back to fascism." I'll say more about that a lot today. "We can find more ominous warning signals in situations of political deadlock in the face of crisis, threatened conservatives looking for tougher allies, ready to give up due process and the rule of law, seeking mass support by nationalist and racialist demagoguery. Fascists are close to power," hear this now, "when conservatives begin to borrow their techniques, appeal to their mobilizing passions, and try to co-opt the fascist following to join them." Just listen to NPR on the way over to get my coffee, you'll forgive me. And it was an excellent piece by two journalists on the stunning rise of neo-fascism, not only all the way across Europe. If I'd have been taking notes, I could name you the countries, at least a dozen of them, all the way to Eastern Europe, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, all the way into the Middle East, Turkey. Seems there's a worldwide movement toward the preference for a strong man. It's not just, my opinion. I may well do a piece on this, the rise of the strong man globally, strong men globally around the planet. I love history. I can't remember another time like this, except back in the 1920s and 30s. So it's not just Germany we talk about in parallel with from time to time. This is a worldwide movement, and from the perspective of both history and the sweep of spiritual history, we understand that they are conjoined in some way. That's why I love studying the theology of politics, the theology of culture, the theology of history, or the one that guides and drives it, or it provides a framework for understanding it. First thoughts, America at the brink. You know, that I can't count the number of articles that I've read with that kind of lead in one way or another. Certainly a common headline we see today, as the vast majority of political pundits and just plain folks will tell you, as I talk to them in the community pretty much every day, the sense that something's very wrong today. Most people, Christians or non, don't understand exactly. We point to the economy, we point to Donald Trump, we point to the weather patterns, we point to the environmental issues, we point to the racial divides. But if you corner someone and say, well, what's really underlying all this? Very few people understand that. And I'm not setting myself up again as some kind of seer. But again, I've spent a lifetime learning how to read, how to think, how to put factors together, assimilate them, and offer you a reasonable assessment of those factors. Hope I can do that today, because what we're covering is really quite broad and deep as well, as usual. Anyway, as a result, people are scared. They're scared. They're nervous. They're angry. They're on short ends. I've never. I better not tell too much of this, but in traffic, noticing a pattern. If I'm in the middle lane, there'll be somebody just speeding like 3 times the speed limit in the right lane, or another lane around me, and they're driving mad. They're driving angry. I've read articles about motorcyclists. A number of accidents have written because they're going nuts. I've seen some of the videotapes on YouTube. You know, they're doing 120 miles an hour on a bike. I think it's just part of the symptomatic results of stressful times. But there's a lot of fear. And there's another group, not the fearsome or the fearful, angry, frustrated ones. There's another group that fascinates me and upsets me, frankly, because I see a huge chunk of it in our churches. Deniers. It's going to be fine. Everything's going to be wonderful. Don't worry. We've been here. We've been in crises before. We're going to return. It's going to be good, which is the president's narrative, and picked up by a vast chunk of the church. But at the brink of what exactly? That's what we're talking about. I offer a little section on Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, not to try to impress you, but it came to mind. I used to study it back in grad school, and no, I'm not a particle physicist, which really is the stuff of which Werner Heisenberg's mathematics were born. But there's an application that I found in Griffith University's professor in physics, Howard Wiseman, makes, and I won't quote it all, it's fairly lengthy, about the uncertainty principle, not only as a phenomenon of science, but also as a very human experience in times of crisis, in times indeed of uncertainty, which is the nature of the time in which we're engaged right now. He writes, and I'll give you a couple excerpts, the term uncertainty principle suggests some grand philosophical idea, like you can never be sure of anything, or there are some things you can never be sure of, and some people use that as kind of a guiding philosophy of life. It's not the right one that comes from the uncertainty principle. He ends with a bit of a riddle, a puzzle. Well, the uncertainty principle does not mean there are some things you can never be sure of. It does imply you can never be sure of everything. Now, that's true. We see through a glass darkly. I just repeated it in our prayer. We can't know everything like God knows everything, but some of us really want to. Science really wants to. They call it, they're looking for the literally. I believe it's from Stephen Hawking. The desire for a theory of everything. I've mentioned this weeks and weeks ago, perhaps months, so that we can establish some great universal covering law that would allow us to predict everything right down to when you're going to trim your toenails in the morning. That's not going to happen either, but it sometimes, for some radical scientific efforts, remains a bit of a grail. But what I've done is shamelessly hijack this idea of the uncertainty principle and apply it to a little bit more of science before I get back to theology, reminding you again, I don't believe good science and good theology are ever in disagreement. So now this next part of this is a little controversial. What's this guy's name? Gene Hamer in 2005 published a theory, a maxim, if you will, that he called the God gene. And what he tried to do was make the case that human beings' proclivity for, propensity toward worshiping God and the supernatural is built into our genetic makeup. I don't know if that's true or not, but it's a fascinating idea when we remember that God is our maker. He fashioned us, and we're the only species on the planet that have this, again, proclivity to look to something higher than us to explain things. All right, I won't go into too much detail, but out of that I draw a maxim. And that's why I mentioned these two scientific principles. Actually, I mentioned a third. I'm waxing scientific today, or in the last few days in preparing this, and that's the law of Occam's razor, or the principle of parsimony. And I reduce it to a simple maxim deriving from these scientific frameworks. And this is me speaking now. Quote myself. You know, every now and then you get old enough you can quote yourself. God is the only absolute certainty in the cosmos. Human beings attached closely to God are thereby able to reduce uncertainty maximally by their proximity to Him. Think about that a little bit. I believe it's true, and I believe it derives as much from science as it does from theology. According to the God gene hypothesis, spirituality has a genetic component of which VMAT2, which is the scientific term that references the tendency of the brain to engage these sort of high mystical experiences, comprises one component by contributing to sensations associated with supernatural mystic experiences, including the presence of God and feelings of connection to a larger universe. Now, don't start labeling me heretic. I'm just saying this would never replace the scripture and the role of the Holy Spirit in superintending the experiences of men and women throughout the earth. But it's intriguing. I always like the idea of God says it, and then it takes about 1,200 years for science to catch up to it and discover its utility and its reality. All right. The point, whether or not this is a valid finding, my argument from both science and theology is that only God, which is the purpose of this whole series, only God can provide the wisdom and spiritual reassurance America or any other society needs, vital to its survival, success, and ultimately mastery of the times in which we are now engaged. I'm not saying we shouldn't try science. I'm not saying we shouldn't try politics. But once those two things breach the Godhead and displace Him, if that could ever be done, then we're in trouble. And I think America is in more trouble than it's ever been in its existence. That includes the Civil War. I'm finding that phrase in almost everything I read, including the Civil War, in all kinds of different sources, both secular and religious as well. All right, so I mentioned before, I want to go to an article, fascinating little thing, by Joseph Blakey, prolific Christian author. I can't remember how many books he's read. This is an article from Red State, December 11th, 2015. For those of you who are in the know, this is before Red State went red, fully red. And they fired all their journalists who didn't agree with a certain political algorithm, and now it's pro-administration, pro-Trump all the way. But before that happened, Blakey was writing for them in this one piece. And he proposed no fewer than 3 possible American futures. This is in 2015 now, very important year for me and you, as America began to cross the transom. When Trump threw in his hat to the election, when we thought America was going to continue to go in not entirely great ways, but the same way. History and the God of history had a very, very radically different idea in store for us and an experience, politically, spiritually, economically, and in every other way, commercially. All right. American future number 1, catastrophe, collapse, and balkanization. I quote, "The first future is catastrophe followed by collapse and balkanization. Sadly, in many ways, it seems to be the most likely scenario." I disagree. I'll tell you why later. America is divided in ways far deeper than at any point in our history, including the Civil War period. Again, I see this more and more. There is little, if anything, its disparate groups can agree on. We differ on economic philosophy, cultural values, values on the role of government. We can't even agree on such fundamental things as the definition of marriage, when life begins, or whether man is really a man and a woman is really a woman. You can read the rest. Strong point. The balkanization, the shattering of the unity of the Union. That's certainly undergoing, we're experiencing our Union undergoing that now at alarming speed. Second, the progressive police state. This is the one I think we need to keep an eye on. Now notice, he's going to talk about the left a lot as he describes this. I'll say more by revision of that in just a moment. But it's interesting. Quote, "Progressives like to portray themselves as open-minded and tolerant, but in the end, they are the most intolerant people of all. They aspire to absolute power because they believe that only they know how to manage the affairs of everyone else. They cannot and will not suffer any opposition that stands in the way of their grand plan for society. They've created numerous government agencies to control our behavior, and now they are in the process of arming these agencies to the hilt. They are federalizing and militarizing local police forces and stoking an adversarial relationship between the citizens and law enforcement officials." This is back in 2015. "All that is needed is a major crisis to use as a pretext for martial law. Once in place, the progressive police state will not relinquish power unless forced to through revolution." As I mentioned earlier, a crisis is coming, and one can't help but wonder if many of the conditions that are creating it have been intentionally put in place to one day justify an unprecedented power grab. Is that just the left, beloved? No. There's socialism and then there's nationalist socialism. So they're both socialists philosophies. Third, return to God. The more optimistic view, and I quote, "It requires Americans to renounce the suicidal policies that have brought us to the brink of disaster. In this future, Americans elect true conservatives." Now, we could spend 3 studies on that. What is a true conservative? I don't have time today. May do it later. But for those of you in the know already, you know that this is problematic. But anyway, he uses the term that back in 2015, we thought we sort of understood. Americans elect true conservatives to office. They rise up and they fight to win the culture war. They embrace the Convention of States movement. I don't know whatever happened to that. To put in place permanent safeguards for liberty. Most importantly, they turn back to God. Even now, it might be too late to avert catastrophe. Even under this optimistic scenario, it could be we've already fallen too far. That's the question of the day. I ponder it every day. Finally, his conclusion: there are decisions on the immediate horizon that will determine which future America will have. That was 5 years ago. We're at the end game, boys and girls, of that decision-making process. I'm not saying everything depends on the election November 3rd, because many would argue, including this man, that we may not even have a choice. Your choices are vote blue, vote red, vote independent, third party, or don't vote at all. That's about the only options we have. The final option is what the author just cited as revolution. I'm not so sure that would even do it. But anyway, given the division the country's in. Finally, so I think there's one more part of this quote. If we fail to act, we will have only ourselves to blame for the dark future that awaits us. That's true. That's theologically and doctrinally sound. My wife again. Everybody has choices. Americans have choices. You're going to exercise that choice on November 3rd. For another study at another time, there are many on both sides of the aisle, in the church, outside the church, that are expecting unprecedented turmoil and trauma and possibly violence in the wake of that election. I don't know if that's true, but I see the extraordinary potential for it. Conceptual transliteration. I get to watching my time. Perhaps the most powerful historic irony is that second option, the police state, I think now is vastly more possible under the aegis of alt-right Republican nationalism. It's a juggernaut. If you haven't, it's a juggernaut. It goes along with, too, the historic trend that I just heard about on our NPR. It's amazing how God kind of feeds this thesis while I'm on the run. Is that this trend is found everywhere, in the West and the Middle East. I think people, you don't have to be an armchair psychologist, though it probably helps, to understand that when people get in a real critical existential fix and crisis, whatever it takes, man, whoever will do it, I don't care. Just as long as I have a safe lock on my door, food on the table, and the ability to survive and succeed in some measure. Give me a strong man. I think I'll write a series on the rise of strong men. Not so much just the Antichrist, but that spirit of the strong man rising up everywhere. I get real blunt, as you've noticed I get in these last days. There's a quote here about power. I am convinced in my bones that the alt-right nationalists are the greater and more immediate threat, since they currently hold power, and they do. You know why? Because the separation of powers doctrine in the United States Constitution has been thrown out. It's been abrogated. Nobody's manning up in the Congress. Nobody's doing it in the executive. Nobody's doing it in the judicial at the federal level. They are in the lower courts, but not at that large leadership level. Constitution is a magnificent document, but it was never fashioned for a people who are not honorable in some minimal degree. And so it's collapsing. Constitutional freedom, constitutional Republican democracy is collapsing right before our very eyes because nobody's doing what it requires who are in positions of leadership. So I bring a lot of this back. I don't blame it all on him, but you know, I've called him the gaslighter in chief. Donald Trump has a lot to do with history right now. More so than a whole lot of supporters are admitting. He's the fulcrum point. He's the pivot man right now, raised up by God or permitted by God to be that pivot, historical pivot, political pivot. I've called him a number of things, but I tell you before God, with him listening, my best description of President Trump is madman. Madman. I'm not calling him Antichrist yet. I'm not calling him, idiot or, liar. Madman. That term came to me repeatedly in just the last week or two. I was trying to, how do I describe this man? I'm not trying to slander him. I'm trying to describe what I see for 3.5 years now. What I watch, what I hear, on reflection, carefully, thousands of reports of him, both on the air and in print. Let me give you the definition of a madman, combined from Webster's 1828 through later versions of a dictionary definition. A man raving or furious with disordered intellect. A distracted man, a man without understanding, one inflamed with extravagant passion and acting contrary to reason. Also, lunacy, extreme anger, excitement, foolishness, medically, severe mental illness, an antiquated, non-specific term for any mental illness, including psychoses or neuroses of any state of decompensation, the inability to function as a normal human being. Not a doctor, or that kind of doctor, but that's what I think we're dealing with in the White House. If only half that were true, and you combine it with everything else going on in terms of the economy, the environment, coronavirus, and the other matters imposing themselves upon America and the world today, can you now calculate the degree to which we are pitched into an unprecedented crisis, if he's indeed a madman? There's another historical figure that they call madman. His initials were AH. The prototype. I believe, as I've argued long and hard, whether people agree with me or not, or whether I'm right or wrong, I see as a parallel between Nazi Germany and what can accurately be described as an emerging American Reich right now. I'm not discounting the dangers of the socialist left. I not only have fought it for the last 35 years, I was part of it as a Marxist way, way back in the mid-60s. So I know the left is a threat. I see it as a slower threat. I see it as a delayed threat. It's been laying its sights on us for 70, 80 years, all the way back to the old Soviet Union. But it's this nationalist threat that's really taken us by surprise. I was thinking about it on the way over here. For those of you who still enjoy a good fight in the ring, you see a fighter leading with his left, drawing the opponent's attention and focus to defending himself against the left. But then later in the fight, and I've seen this so many times, comes up with a right hook. Maybe a silly comparison, but I see that as part of what's happened politically. We've been, grousing and grinding about the left and the threat on the left for so long, it's become part of us. We can't see anything else. We're wearing the blinders, as are so many in the church and so many of the Trump supporters, and they can't see what's coming from the right onto the scene. That's what I think in part is going on right now. We got caught with our drawers down and our boots off. We did. I'm one of them. And it's here now. It's here now. I moved to a brief description of the madman of Germany by, of all people, psychologist Carl Jung, a Swiss national who served in World War I and who for a period of time watched Hitler very, 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 very carefully as a professional observer of human conduct. I'll just give you a couple of excerpts here, and then I'm going to blast through the rest of this because it gets a little crazy. Here's what he wrote about the Fuhrer in some of his notes, originally published, gosh, I've got here somewhere, 1930s. Anyway, here's some of the excerpts. 1936. In 1936, Jung acknowledges in an article the growing German menace, comparing Hitler to the Norse god Wotan, who represented irrationality and apocalyptic events. Wotan was the Nordic god of war and had long been a cult figure among the Germanic peoples. Wotan was known as a great magician and could intervene magically in battle with his paralyzing power. This god was also a shapeshifter, taking on guises and personalities and other personas as he saw fit, so that he could win the people to his opinion by saying and being anything they needed him to be and say. All these pathological features, complete lack of insight into one's own character, autoerotic self-admiration, denigration and terrorization of one's fellow man, how contemptuously Hitler spoke of his own people, projection of the shadow, lying, falsification of reality, determination to impress by fair means or foul, bluffing, double-crossing, all these were united in that man who was diagnosed clinically as an hysteric and whom a strange fate chose to be the political, moral, and religious spokesman for Germany for 12 years. Is that pure chance? He then gets down to the end of this. Jung suggests a more accurate diagnosis of Hitler's condition would be, quote, pseudologia fantastica in the Latin, which is characterized by a peculiar intent for believing one's own lies. He closes by saying Jung considered the Hitler era a period of epidemic insanity, an eruption of the unconscious into a well-ordered world. Beloved, that's what I see in America. That's what I see in the president. That's what I see in the Republican Party. That's what I see in 80 to 90% of the church who follows him. I've said it, I think, in the last couple of teachings. I think not only is the world America being led by a madman, the country's gone mad. You know, the definition of insanity, I didn't look it up. I started to and needed to get done, is, repeatedly doing the wrong thing, leading to destruction. America's gone mad, and I believe it's led by a madman. You decide for yourselves. Back to the future. I have never been more profoundly moved toward an understanding of this president as I have in researching this commentary. I've read, again, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pieces about him. I've studied him. That's what I was trained to do all the way back in the 60s when I started my focus on political communication with the Kennedys. It's what I do. It doesn't mean I'm always right, but I'm pretty okay at it. And there are 4 phases here. And the reason I tracked it all the way back to Satan's rebellious in the timeless epochs before, in terms of the origin of all this stuff we're dealing with. Then I came to the fall of Adam in the Garden of Eden. I have scriptures for all of this. Then forward to the rise of Babylon under Nimrod. And I have a section here, I don't know if I'll get to it, on Nimrod, how important he was as a prototype, as a template for that strong man that I see arising in America and all around the world more and more. And finally, fourth, America's redefining herself. I've seen us redefine ourselves at light speed in just a little over 3.5 years. That's why the 1,335 days designation. From that shining city on a hill to an apostate nation, now nearly unrecognizable. More like Babylon than Jerusalem. Again, tracking us back to Babel. Where nobody could understand each other, as it is today. As it is today in America. There's a superb summary by Margaret Hunter I'll just touch on concerning that character, enigmatic character Nimrod. We don't know a lot about him. The leader, the head of the Babylonian founding an empire. Babylon was established by Nimrod, who was a mighty hunter and ruler of the earth. He was the son of Cush. His grandfather was Noah's son Ham. Noah was Nimrod's great-grandfather. Nimrod's name means rebel or to rebel. It's not, look, everything means something in God's history and his timeline. And Hebrew scholars state that he lived, listen to me now, his life in total defiance to the Lord. I'm going to say something that's going to upset half of you maybe. I don't believe for 1 minute that Donald Trump is in total submission to Jesus Christ. I don't think he knows Jesus Christ. He doesn't therefore live by Christian protocols or statutes or precepts. Now here I'm in a little bit of a precarious, presumptive place. I believe Donald Trump is hostile to God. I do. For all you people who believe he's pro-life and pro-you and pro-us and pro-America and pro-this, no, I don't believe that for a minute. After 4 years of watching him. I believe he, like Nimrod, like Hitler, like Pol Pot, like Stalin, like Hussein, you name it, that he's in total defiance of God. It's the way I read it. It's not a hastily drawn conclusion. That's why I go to great effort to document my opinions. Before the people left the land of Shinar, she goes on, they began to build that tower that we talked about before. Nimrod went on to establish 2 cities, Babylon and Nineveh. The first places, very, very significantly, of organized false worship. And she makes an excellent case that those deities and those religious icons and systems of thought are still at work in the world today. And my thesis, or my amendment to my thesis, is they're here as never before. A lot of them came on board when we invited them in the 60s, when we got into New Age Eastern mysticism, and they're just running all about right now, infecting and infiltrating even the churches around America, which is why we have these aberrant forms of faith, prosperity. You know, it's all about you getting rich. Didn't start with America. Go all the way back to Nimrod and Babel and Nineveh. Is America becoming Babylon? I'll end on this, most controversial of all. It was none other than David Wilkerson back in 1973 in a book called The Vision that I read probably in the early 80s, where he first started proposing the idea that America and New York in particular were probably the lead candidates for the end times Babylon, about which the book of Revelation in chapter 17 and 18 speak rather horrifyingly. I remember when I read Wilkerson's book, I don't know if I physically did it, it's through the book, this guy's nuts. Are you kidding? This is America. Hey, this is the land of the free, the home of the brave, red, white, and blue, the flag. Come on, freedom, freedom, baby. I thought he was a lunatic. Some people still do. For the record, I don't believe he was a lunatic. While every prophetic insight he's had is hardly perfect, I believe he saw something about America in 1973 that is now coming to the full stature of its usurpation of everything we thought America was. So I'm going to spend a little time on him. In a yet undated sermon that has become fairly widely read, he says a few things. Martin Luther, and I quote, Martin Luther and other Reformation preachers taught that Babylon was the Catholic Church and the Pope the beast. Many believers at that time were martyred for leaving the church, etc. Still a fairly prevalent view today. I'm not sure it's the majority view, but it's still out there. He goes on, but the Babylon John is talking about is something beyond the Catholic Church. The beast is something more powerful than the Pope. Babylon is still a great world power visible before our eyes today. Its power and influence, this was probably written in the 80s, maybe the early 90s. Its power and influence have grown incredibly in the past decade. Until today, it boasts tremendous might. Babylon is not a physical city. It is a spiritual condition. Even as Zion is not just a city in Israel, but also a representation of the true church of Jesus Christ. Babylon is the harlot church, exclamation point. It is a church within the church, a visible body existing with the invisible body of Christ side by side. He quotes somebody named Professor Milligan, who in 1885 wrote this. Listen to this. Babylon is not the Church of Rome in particular. No doubt that church is deeply sinned, as have them all by now. Goodness. But it is not the spiritual harlot. Babylon is all, listen to this. This is incredible. 1885. Babylon is all professed Christians who love the world's favor rather than its reproach. It is those who esteem the honor of the world rather than its shame. It is those who love ease rather than sacrifice, grasping, covetous, but they have no compassion on the poor. Babylon is all, end quote, from Milligan. Babylon is all who anywhere, again, profess to be Christ's little flock, but who are not. Think immediately of that horrifying passage when Jesus turns to somebody who's been following him all their lives, and he says, "Depart from me, you lawless. I never knew you." But who are not, because they deny him by their actions. This is so important, beloved. This is existentially critical that we understand this in humility before God. He finishes, Babylon, as far as I am concerned, is any church, any ministry, any minister, any Christian in league with the world. Hear him. It is made up of certain pastors, evangelists, and the multitude of Christians, all who have been seduced by covetousness and worldly mindedness. It is a religion that has been polluted in its ungodly methods and a sanctuary. Man, I gotta really emphasize this. A sanctuary corrupted. I've made this point, but not as brilliantly as this man, by ungodly alliances. You cannot sit at the table of God and drink from the cup of Satan at the same time. Ever. You cannot form a pragmatic alliance with a leader who will get you what you think you need by means that are straight out of the belly of hell. It can't be done, and you will pay such a price for it. Not according to me or even Wilkerson. According to the word of the Messiah himself. Don't do it. Sever those alliances. Sever them today, tonight. John's prophecy is being fulfilled before our eyes. He completes even now. God is soon going to bring down every unspiritual church, every unspiritual ministry, every backslidden minister, every lukewarm worldly Christian. I've said it in the words of the Messiah again and again. I think we've got about a year at best, church, to prevent God from withdrawing your lampstand, shutting you down, firing you. Favorite phrase of a certain president. He's not messing around. I love the fact that Pastor Daniel in our local church, Friday Church, or I'm not sure it's Friday Church, preached such a fiery message about this. Don't bow to the politics and the politicians. God, no. You bow to the one who formed the government in the first place, or its provisions and templates when it's done right. You don't bow to the politician. You don't bow and grovel before governors and senators and congressmen and presidents and prelates. You don't do it. Exodus 20, first commandment. You shall have what? No other gods before me, says the Lord. Not a one. So Mystery Babylon, as I begin to complete all this, so many pages. I go into, basically there's two kinds of Babylon, lots of scriptures, lots of quotes. Religious Babylon and commercial Babylon. Religious Babylon is you'll find outlined in detail in Revelation 17. Commercial political Babylon in Revelation 18, and they're joined under the nomenclature, the name of Mystery Babylon, in basically two parts, coexisting at the same time. An American Babylon, I ask as a question. Is it possible that we see America move from a shining city on a hill to a ship of fools in 1,335 days? I don't have time to go into all the arguments that are in print. I really want you to read this one, beloved. This has got more bite and depth to it than I've ever been able to present. Maybe it's all hooey. I don't think so. I have a statement here under a sober assessment. For 3.5 years now, we have been laboring recklessly and furiously as a nation to earn that dark distinction. We've been working hard at it, boys and girls. The case for an American Babylon. I state two and document thoroughly with quotes. Number one, God is angry. Unlike this national expert on Revelation who I heard in that same local church 3 weeks ago, outrageously claimed that, you're going to be fine because God's in a really good mood. I don't know if the guy's on drugs or he's just naturally blind. God's not in a good mood. When he rides back as the Lion of Judah, he's not coming back with a big smile on his face and little flowers to hand out. He's coming back as the righteous judge of the nations, and the church first. Second, America is now in focused judgment. I've said some of this before with the quotes, with the documentation. Why is America the focus? Why is America the epicenter of the plague? Why is America seeming to get beat up more than anybody else by these certain judgments and afflictions? We were supposed to know better. To whom much is given, much is going to be required, and they will receive always the stricter judgment. Then I go to a section from R.A. Coombs, who's passed away by now. He spent his lifetime studying the scriptures and the history of Babylon, came to the conclusion in the 1990s, specifically in 1998, that America was the Babylon. I'm offering this to you as food for debate and thought and reflection. Go ahead, have it out in the thread. Stay nice. Well, stay civil. Sometimes Nice won't get it. Stay civil and respectful of your opponent. I haven't quite drawn my own conclusion, but I'm impressed by the evidence. Combs, for example, assembled a list of 60 scriptural indices, criteria, by which he came to the conclusion that America was likely Babel. I cite you some. A Jewish population center, Jeremiah 50. Well, I don't have time to go through all these. A key commercial nation and engine of world wealth for the entire world economy, a deepwater port city, the world's policeman. He just goes through all these. You may have read it. It's controversial, but it's well scripturally supported, and I wouldn't have offered it if it wasn't. The Wilkerson view, as I keep promising to close and don't. The vision that he had in 1973 is summarized by one piece. I don't know that I wrote. I wrote the author here. Check author. I'll check that. By 5 major trends that he saw increasing in America. 1, the economy. Worldwide economic recession that will affect the lifestyle of every wage earner in the world. He really blew it on timeline. Other great men have done it as well. That's why I'm not ever going to specify a date. 2nd, natural abnormalities. This is back in 73. Nature having labor pains, and he points to a number of those. Yeah, I'll get to you, Tiffany. 3, sexual sin. Flood of pornographic filth in America's media broadcasts and print that are exported to the whole world. I remember I went to give a paper in Jerusalem in 1996. The 3,000th anniversary of Jerusalem. And I was in my hotel room just spinning channels and seeing some incredibly local and enjoyable broadcasts. And boom, all of a sudden, there's Playboy Channel in full nudity, frontal nudity on the screen. It tortured me, and I got angry. I ran downstairs to the manager, and I said, what in the blue blazes are you guys doing in Jerusalem, putting uncensored Playboy Channel? You know what he told me? Oh, well, he said in his Israeli accent, yeah, America helped. We put together a deal, and they bring those things to us. They bring those things to us. 4th, family disruption, 73. Rebellion in the homes with children hating their parents. Persecution of the remnant. Persecution madness against truly spirit-filled Christians who love Christ and will under no circumstances forsake him. 1973. Last thoughts. I believe America has become radically redefined. It took 120 years, but in the last 3 to 5, it's just gone ballistic. Most of you know that already. And so I get to the teaching from the scripture that we started with today, actually 2 sessions ago, and make these 2 points. First, there is the wisdom of the world that has seduced the church. I've offered evidence for that for weeks and weeks now, maybe months. Man cannot live, this is from William MacDonald, by his own wisdom. Man cannot by his own wisdom come to the knowledge of God. Starts there, and then he goes into a full paragraph of why that is. America cannot save herself. Science won't save her. Donald Trump's not going to save her. The Republican and Democratic Party and Joe Biden's not going to save America. Not going to happen. It is not going to happen. I'm not saying don't vote. I'm not saying give up. I'm just saying start with reality. The answer for America, the only one that has ever been, is to understand first that our own wisdom is so severely, nearly fatally limited. And the futility of man by Albert Barnes, since or seeing that it is true by the world wisdom knew not God. America's just, we don't care about him anymore, beloved. We don't. Not really. Not even in the churches, except there are some waking up. Thank God. And if yours is, tell us, name it. so we can pray for them. Pastors are waking up. Application to America for a nation bathed in the richness of the gospel over 200 years, from which place launched the most aggressive evangelization of the world has ever known. To have come to this present place of wretchedness is beyond tragic. It is without exaggeration historic, even epochal, a word I use. I know too much. I gave you in one of my little posts mysterious passage from the days of Shinar and Sodom from Genesis 14. In the days of the eastern kings Amraphel of Shinar, Arioch of Elasar, Chedorlaomer of Elam, and Tidal of Goim. They invited the Jordan Valley, and talks about Chedorlaomer, who apparently was the ruling king. But the one word that characterized that period that I got in prayer one morning, rebellion, rebellion, rebellion. Nimrod is the very name of rebellion. America is in rebellion. And if you don't understand that in the church, then you're wrong, and you're leading your people to the edge of some sort of abyss. The church and America is in rebellion. I don't say that with my own emotional conviction. I know this is God. I know he's telling me to say this. And that's the first step toward redemption and correction and hope and life. Matthew Henry comments, the wars of nations make great figure in history, but we should not have had the record of this war if Abram and Lot had not been concerned. In some ways, that period were the launches of the first wars. To this concluding comment. Revelation 18, 4 through 6. Here's the message. Here's what I just heard Justin Peters. I love his commentaries on YouTube. Recommend him. I want to just say one thing here about Matthew Henry's commentary about all this. Many an honest man fares the worse, similar to the passage I just read to you about alliances, for his wicked neighbors, who you choose as your friends, who you choose as your compatriots, who you choose as leaders and teachers and allies, can kill you, or it can be part of your redemption. Choose well. Finally, Revelation 18, and I heard another voice from heaven saying, come out of her, my people, so that you will not be a partner in her sins and receive her plagues. For her sins, crimes, and transgressions have piled up as high as heaven, and God has remembered her wickedness and crimes for judgment. Repay to her even as she has repaid others, and pay back to her double her torment in accordance with what she has done in the cup of sin and suffering, which she mix a double portion of perfect justice for her. Whoever you determine Babylon to be, get the heck out of her. Okay? And encourage your friends and your family to do the same. I have an end note here. I think of those 6 seals in Revelation 6, I see 3 or 4 of them open. War hasn't come yet, and I've been reading stuff. I may do a study on it, particularly with Iran. I don't know why. It's just an impression, very fleeting maybe, that something to do with the Middle East peace agreement in Iran could be a flashpoint. And so we know wars are coming. Just in the words of the Messiah, do this. All of you must keep awake, Matthew 26:41. All of you, us, must keep awake. Give strict attention, be cautious and active, and watch and pray, that you may not come into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is so very weak. That's all I got for you guys. Please read this. If you feel so moved, share it with those whom God nudges you to share. Love you all. We'll start a new series next week. I'm going to pull back from the brink a little bit myself and reassess things tomorrow. I'm going to take the whole day off, meet with a friend or two, or just kind of relax and get a sense of where I go from here. Love you all so very much. God bless. See you next time.